A major piece of evidence for evolution and common descent is shown to be incorrect by magnitudes, and yet proponents continue to proclaim it because they are either unaware of the latest studies or unwilling to accept them. You've probably heard that chimps and humans share about 99% genetic similarities. Buckle your seatbelt because the emerging truth will surprise you. It challenges that head on. Here to talk about it is Dr. Casey Luskin, a friend for probably a couple decades or so, and the author of Science and Human Origins. Casey, this is long overdue, but thanks for coming on the show.
Oh, so glad to be here with you, Sean, and grateful for the opportunity.
Well, let's jump right in. I'm really curious. This is, again, first time on the show, but we've known each other for a while. Tell us the backstory of just what got you first interested in the topic of origins in general, to work at Discovery, to write on this, and then human origins in particular.
Sure, I'll give you the relatively short version of the story, Sean, but I got interested in the topic of origins when I was an undergraduate science major at the University of
Mm.
California, San Diego. I was an earth sciences major, but for almost all of my electives, I would take courses in evolution. And as I took more and more courses in evolution, I felt that the explanations just were not adding up. We would learn about all these incredibly complex and beautiful features in living systems, but my classes would never even try to give Darwinian explanations for how those complex features might have evolved. And so, like a lot of college students, we would stay up late in the dorms talking about crazy things like the origin of life, et cetera. And at the end of my freshman year, a friend suggested that I read this book called Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. You are familiar with that book, no doubt.
Yeah.
And, I read his ideas about irreducible complexity, where multiple parts are needed to be able to provide function for a system, and how this provides a challenge to Darwinian evolution. And I felt like Behe really put into words a lot of the ideas that my sort of rudimentary freshman brain was thinking about the inevolvability of many complex features. No offense to freshmen in college. They're very smart people, but I felt like Behe really put into words what I was trying to articulate. And so from there, it was just all downhill, Sean. I started reading books by and articles by other ID folks like William Dembski,
Mm.
Jonathan Wells, Steve Meyer, and I got really interested in this fascinating debate over where we came from. And now, what got me interested in human origins, I think, is that not just learning about human evolution in my classes. We would study these hominid fossils in my classes, but just frankly, being a human being who lives in this world. I mean, what topic is more interesting than where we came from and
Mm.
how humans came to exist? And so the question of human origins really just gripped my interest over the years. And then again, I won't give you the long story here, but from 2016 to 2020, I had the opportunity. My wife and I, we moved to South Africa and lived there for about 4.5 years. And while living there, I got to visit many fossil sites that have produced
Mm.
many of the supposed, hominid fossils that are supposed to be our ancestors. So that got me even more interested in the topic, being able to see these sites and in some cases the fossils in person. And so it's just been a topic I've been really interested in, had a lot of opportunities to read about and write about over the years.
Well, you not only bring study and interest in this, you bring passion, which helps come this topic alive. And I love it just like you do to talk about this stuff. Let's narrow down a little bit. What's interested you specifically in the topic of human-chimp genetic similarity?
Yeah, on this one, Sean, I was thinking about this question when you sent it to me. And I think, again, it's just kind of like being a human being who lives in this world. And I've constantly heard over the years people telling us that we are just 99% genetically similar to apes. And we're basically just slightly modified apes. And I've always wondered, is that really true, scientifically speaking, that we are 99% genetically similar to apes, or, only 1% genetically different? And so I followed this debate over the years. And as we've sort of had this revolution in genome sequencing over the last 20 or 30 years, we've been able to sequence the human genome, then sequence the ape genome, the chimp genome, and other ape genomes. We've had more and more data be able to bear on this question. And so it's just something that I've been following as the
Mm.
science has come out over the years.
That's a great answer. Now, can you give us some examples like of people who've claimed that we're 99% genetically similar to chimps or apes, or kind of 1% different from them? And as they use that to make an argument for common descent slash evolution. So give us examples just to make sure you're not setting up a straw man and people realize how popular this claim has been.
Yeah, I mean, we've all heard this argument, but yeah, it's important to document things and show, who is making this argument. Well, it's coming from really the highest levels of the scientific community. 2 summers ago, in August of 2023, I visited the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C. And when you walk into their human origins exhibit, Sean, right there on the wall in very big letters, it says, "You and chimpanzees, 98.8% genetically similar." And it
Hmm.
goes on to say in a sort of a smaller caption on the wall that we're only 1.2% genetically different from chimpanzees. I'm sure that many folks have heard of Bill Nye the Science Guy. I used to watch Bill Nye back in the day.
Yeah.
He wrote a book in 2014 called Undeniable: Evolution and the Science of Creation. And he said in that book, quote, "We share around 98.8% of our gene sequence with chimpanzees." And then he says, "This is striking evidence for chimps and chumps to have a common ancestor." Okay. So very clearly, Bill Nye is making an explicit argument for common ancestry from the supposed, 98.8% genetic similarity between humans and chimps. And we could keep doing this all day, but let me give you just a couple more quick examples.
Yeah, please.
There was a book published, a book published by University of Chicago Press in 2008, and the title was 99% Ape: How Evolution Adds Up. And this book was authored by 7 university professors. And here's what this book says. It says, quote, "Of the roughly 3 billion letters of the genetic code, they say that, quote, the difference is just 1.06%.
Mm.
So what they're saying, again, in their words, the difference is, quote, 1% of 3 billion. So they're very explicitly saying that if you look at the entire genome, this is the haploid genome, basically, one half of your genome you would get from one of your parents, that exactly 1%, 1.06% out of all 3 billion DNA letters is different. And on the backside, the back cover of this book, it says that Darwin was mocked for suggesting that humans have apes for ancestors. But it says, quote, "Every scientific advance in the study of life in the last 150 years has
Whoa.
confirmed the reality of evolution." So they're making, a very forceful argument for human ape common ancestry and and what they say is the reality of evolution, based upon the idea that when you look at the entire genome, they say that only 1% of it is different from apes. And again, you want more examples? The journal Science in 1998 said, this is a quote from an article titled "Which of Our Genes Makes Us Human?" It says, "We humans like to think of ourselves as special, but when it comes to
Mm.
genes, humans are so similar to the 2 species of chimpanzee that physiologist Jared Diamond has called us the third chimpanzee." And it says, "For any given region of the human genome, humans and chimpanzees share at least 98.5% of their DNA." So note here, Sean, that they're making this argument based upon the entire human genome, not just upon certain, say, protein coding sequences or certain gene sequences. They're saying that the entire genome from one end to the other is 98 or 99% genetically similar to that of a chimp. And we could do this all day. I mean, I've documented so many cases of this that I don't want to bore your viewers to death here, but just suffice to say, we've all heard this argument being made and it's out there, but you can find prestigious examples from the highest levels of the scientific community, people making this argument, and also science popularizers like Bill Nye. It's a very common argument that we've heard.
Thank you for quoting Captain America that we can do this all day. I can do this all day. Good job. Way to weave that in subtly. Now, a couple quick
I'm
things.
kind of on a Marvel kick right now. I'm in the middle of
Oh,
watching Loki season 1, so I'm kind of getting I'm kind of getting into Marvel right now. So anyway,
well, I just did a 2.5 hour interview with Todd McFarlane, one of the most influential comic creators of the past 4 decades. Going to release that soon. So, folks who know who that is, hang tight. That's coming up. But you said something I just want to highlight on. You said in one of these references, it said we like to think of ourselves as special. Now, there's a difference between the genetic similarity and what we draw from this for what it means to be human, and even concluding that is just filled with worldview implications, and we'll get to that. But I have to pause for people to realize when we talk about the science of human origins, it's not worldview neutral. We're all bringing a certain lens to the table. And of course, we have to interpret the data. Now, you gave an example of a book from the University of Chicago, the Smithsonian, Bill Nye, the science guy. This is all over the place. I checked earlier this morning, and according to the Smithsonian website, in 2024, 3.9 million people visited the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. And that's the museum. Did I get the museum correct? The Museum of Natural History. That
The
is
National Museum of Natural History, yeah.
that is their top visited museum by 1.8 million people. So there's a ton of people seeing this and having their worldview shaped by it. Now, we're going to come to a journal article that recently came out in Nature that I think in many ways is blowing this thing up. But when did people first start to realize that this is what we would call an icon of evolution and it's actually wrong? When did that data first emerge?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it first became clear when they first published the first draft of the chimpanzee genome, which I believe was around 2005. And in fact, in 2007, the journal Science actually had an article that kind of criticized this 1% statistic. They called it, quote, the myth of 1%. And this
Huh.
article in the journal Science said that the 1% statistic is a, quote, myth or truism that they said should be retired. And they said it's even more of a hindrance for understanding than a help. So I think that it was around that time when they first sequenced the chimp genome that people realized it's a lot more complicated than just saying we're only 1% different, and the data may not even support that.
Now, I just want to highlight this for folks. That's 2 decades ago at the time you and I are recording this. This has been known. People have had time to catch up displays at the Smithsonian, books, journal articles with the data, and yet still it hasn't been corrected. Now, I call this an icon of evolution, which is borrowing a term from probably one of the most famous neo-Darwinian critics, Jonathan Wells, trained at, if I remember, Berkeley and maybe Yale as well, just high-level scientist. Such a kind man, but also a bulldog. He was at Biola many times, got to sit down and have lunch with him, got to interview him one time. Just so kind and thoughtful. He actually came to speak. I had a Case for Creator event when Lee Strobel's book came out 20 years ago. And Jonathan Wells brought a flash drive and gave me all of his slides for free. Like, so kind. Well, he coined this term icons of evolution, and wrote a book on it. Explain what he means by icons of evolution. And do you, Casey, think the human-chimp genetic similarity falls into that category?
Yeah, I agree with you. Jonathan Wells was a really kind man. He passed away about a year ago in September of 2024, and we really
Mm.
miss him a lot here at Discovery Institute. And his book, Icons of Evolution, was very influential on me. It was one of those books I read when I was an undergraduate that really got me interested in this subject because I'd taken all these courses in evolution. I was taught the icons. So what is an icon? He defines an icon. He says, quote, these examples are so frequently used as evidence for Darwin's theory that most of them have been called icons of evolution. Yet all of them, he says, in one way or another, misrepresent the truth. And
Mm.
I would argue that, yeah, although Jonathan did not include human-chimp genetic similarity as one of the icons of evolution in his original book, I think it fits its definition of an icon almost perfectly because we can see that this has been used as an argument for evolution. You know, whether it logically is an argument for evolution, we can talk about that, but it's been used as an argument for evolution over and
Mhm.
over again. I mean, I can't imagine that hardly any of your viewers have not heard this argument that we are 99% genetically similar to a chimp, 1% different, and therefore we share a common ancestor. And yet the argument is not correct. The science shows that we are not only 99% genetically similar to a chimp or 1% different. The differences are much greater than that. We'll get into that. So I think it fits Jonathan Wells's definition of an icon very, very well.
Do you have a sense of how significant this is in a piece of evidence that's offered for evolution? And what I mean by that, I realize on YouTube might be different than in a high school textbook, might be different than in a college textbook or in the journal articles. But like, where would you place it in terms of just kind of its popularity and the force that people have said? Is this like, yeah, this is 17 on my list or this is top 5? And I know you're just kind of guessing and assessing this. How significant would you say this claim is or has been?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know if I can pull a number out of thin air, Sean, but I would say that it has been used by evolutionists. So, many evolutionists believe that it is a very rhetorically persuasive argument for evolution, and it has been up there as one of their top arguments that they use for evolution. And this again is being used by folks coming from the highest levels of the scientific community. I mean, the Smithsonian Institution really wants you to know that you are 98.8% genetically similar to a chimp. It's right there in huge letters as you walk into the human origins exhibit. The journal Science, many other prominent folks have made this argument, but then many other just popular folks. I mean, we've seen this argument made from top to bottom. So I would say that many evolutionists, at the very least, they believe that it is a very powerful and persuasive argument for evolution. Whether it really is or should be, we can talk about that. I personally don't think that logically it really means that much, but certainly a lot of folks believe that it is, and so it's been up there. Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's start getting into that and maybe break it down for us how this original 1% genetic difference calculation was derived. And of course, most people watching this, myself included, are not PhDs in science. Even though I've written a book on understanding intelligent design with your colleague William Dembski, that's not my specialty. So break it down for the non-specialist how they first got that 1% genetic calculation.
By the way, your book, Understanding Intelligent Design, is still a great introductory book on ID, Sean, and I still
Oh,
recommend it to
thanks.
people. So really, really great work you and Bill Dembski did. But yeah, so if you think of our genome like a long string of letters, okay, we actually have 46 chromosomes, each of which has, millions of nucleotide bases. And it's the ordering of these nucleotide bases in your DNA that determines things like the ordering of amino acids in your proteins or how to regulate the production of proteins and many other features, how to, where and when to produce limbs as you're developing, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm.
It's encoded in the DNA molecules in your cells. Okay. And so our genome has about 3 billion nucleotides. If you look at just half the genome, the half that you would get from one parent, if you add, the half from one parent to the half of the other parent, it's about close to 7 billion total nucleotides. Okay. And as we just saw, people will do an analysis looking at just one half of your genome, what you got from one parent. Okay. Again, it's about maybe 3.2 billion nucleotides. Some people have said, and we heard this in some of the quotes I gave earlier, that when you look at one half of the genome, the entire 3.2 billion nucleotides, that 99% of those nucleotides are going to be in the same order in a human being
Hmm.
as they are in a chimp. Okay. Only 1% of it is different. So they claimed the way that they did the calculation, at least some people have claimed, is that it's based upon looking at the entire 3.2 billion nucleotides in your haploid genome, is what it's called. Okay. Now, I don't really believe that was ever true because
Sure.
we never really had complete ape genomes for comparison until just recently. So, how they
Mm.
made that claim in that 2008 book, 99% Ape, that 99% of our entire genome is the same as a chimpanzee. I don't know how they knew that because we didn't
Interesting.
have complete ape genomes until just recently
Huh.
with this Nature paper that just came out. I think what they were really doing is they were really talking about certain proteins in humans that might be 99 or even maybe even like in some cases 100% similar to chimps. And that's true. There are certain protein sequences. We're just talking about individual proteins that
Okay.
might have amino acids that are in virtually the exact same order in the human version of that protein as they are in the chimp version of that protein. And as an ID proponent, I want to say, Sean, this doesn't bother me at all because these kinds of functional similarities could represent common design just as much as they could represent common descent.
Okay,
Okay.
hold that thought. I'm gonna jump in.
Okay.
We're gonna get towards interpreting this. I just want to
Okay.
make sure we give the data first as carefully as we can. So you explained how that 1% genetic difference was derived before the chimp genome was even mapped out, interestingly enough. But now you sent me, actually this summer, we sat down for coffee. I think it was June or July, where I live, and you even got to try out my new e-bike that I zip around and kind of my new my new toy. Everyone has one in Southern Orange County. It was kind of fun. But you shared this Nature paper with me that was not on my radar, and I was stunned. That argues that the difference is really 14.9%. Now, any scientist right away will know how significant nature is, but maybe explain why that journal is so significant and just kind of briefly how they derived this 15% rough difference.
Yeah, so I mean, the journal Nature is widely considered to be one of the top scientific journals, if not the top scientific journal in the world. And in
Mm.
April, they published a very large paper titled Complete Sequencing of Ape Genomes. And for the first time, this paper presented what they called telomere to telomere sequences of the ape genomes. What that basically means is from one end of the chromosomes to the other, they sequenced the entire ape genomes for chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, and some other apes. And
Mm.
they did it from scratch. Okay. You may not believe this, but some of the early drafts of the chimp genome actually used the human genome as a guide or a scaffolding when they produced these early drafts of the chimp genome. And that made the earlier versions of the chimp genome look more human like than they actually were. But these newly sequenced ape genomes, they were complete sequences of the ape genomes and they were done from scratch. They didn't use the human genome as a guide. So I think this is probably the most reliable data set of the chimp and other ape genomes ever produced to date. And what they basically found is that there are two major types of differences in when you compare the human and the chimp genomes. One is called the single nucleotide variation. This is when you basically just have two long stretches of DNA that are very similar, so you can align them, and you just count the nucleotides that are different.
Huh,
Okay,
okay.
and they found that 1.6% of the human and chimp genomes are different when you talk about the single nucleotide variation. Now, the other type of difference is a little bit more complicated. This is what they called the gap divergence. And they found that when you look at the gap divergence, that the human and chimp genomes are about 13.3% difference.
Mm.
Okay. And the gap divergence basically mean that when you try to align the two genomes, you find that sometimes one section of a genome is missing in the other genome or it failed to align. And so it introduces what they called gaps. And that means it's either that it failed to align or, as they put it, it was inconsistent with a simple one-to-one alignment. Can I explain this really quick using a language analogy from human language?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so let's say that you have two sequences of letters, and one sequence reads A, B, C, D, E, and the other sequence reads V, W, X, Y, Z. Okay, those two sequences are so different that you can never line them up and try to compare them. They're like 0% different. So, in their analysis, this would be like saying that the DNA, quote, failed to align. They're just so different that you can't even line them up. But then there's another type of difference
Mm.
that they called inconsistent with a simple one-to-one alignment. And this has to do with the fact that a lot of the genetic differences between humans and chimps is found in DNA, which is repetitive. You have the same DNA sequences that repeat over and over again. Now, these repeat sequences aren't necessarily junk DNA. We'll talk about that more later, but they are repetitive. And under the analysis that they did, they used a computer program to align the DNA. Under their program, a given stretch of DNA is only allowed to be aligned one single time to the other genome. Okay. So
Okay.
once it's been aligned, you can't use it a second time. So let's consider an example from the old nursery rhyme, row, row, row your boat. Okay.
Okay.
Let's say again, you have two sequences. One sequence says row, 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 and the other sequence just says the word row one time. So the first sequence has three copies of the word row, and the second sequence only has one copy of the word row. So if you're comparing those two sequences, then in the one sequence that only has one copy, that instance of the word row can align, okay? But the second and third instances of the word row, they don't have a matching counterpart in the other genome, okay? Because there's only one copy of the word row. So that would be like a gap of 6 letters, two instances of the word row. It would be a 6 letter gap. And how they would put this is that it's inconsistent with a simple one-to-one alignment. So to make a long story short,
Okay.
when you add this up, you're counting up nucleotides or adding percentages. You get a 1.6% difference from the single nucleotide variation and a 13.3% difference from what they call the gap divergence. You can just add those two percentages up and you get a total of a 14.9% genetic difference between the human and chimp genomes. And that's where the number comes from.
Okay, so it's not that the 1% was wrong. It was just incomplete and not taking the entirety of the genome, including the gaps and the other repetitive features that you mentioned. So we take the genome in its entirety, including, I think you said 1.6 was the number, add it to the 13.2 or 3, and you get to about 15%. So that math makes sense to me. Now, before we go any further, there's some objections that I've come across and I've seen you address, but are these numbers being challenged? Are critics accepting them, saying this is the new data? Or are we going to see a journal article come out in Nature in 3 months and go, nope, it's really 2%. These guys are off base. We recant.
Yeah. So to go back to Jonathan Wells really quick, he wrote a sequel to Icons of Evolution called Zombie Science,
It's a
where
great
he
book.
said that these icons, they're kind of like zombies, where they don't die easily. And people continue to defend these icons of evolution long after they've been shown to be false. So I was kind of anticipating that folks would not give up the 1% human chimp genetic similarity icon very easily. And that prediction has turned out to be true. There's been a lot of pushback and a lot of I would say, critique from many different angles. So, yeah, there are some folks who are challenging the numbers, but for the most part, folks are not challenging the actual numbers. They're not challenging the data from this paper in Nature that found that, I think it's pretty clear that we are about 14.9% genetically different from chimps. In fact, what was interesting is there's an evolutionary geneticist named Richard Buggs, who's a professor at Queen University London. And on his blog, he posted an analysis of this paper and basically came to the same numbers that I did. And what's interesting is that Professor Buggs, he was actually thanked in the acknowledgments of the Nature paper that
Huh.
reported these complete ape genomes. He wasn't a co-author of the paper, but they thanked him. So he clearly is, a relevant thinker on this topic. And he basically came to the exact same numbers that I did when I was thinking about how to add those two numbers together. And so it's always nice to see an expert who comes to the same conclusion. So I am very confident that these numbers are right. And when you look at a lot of the objections, they're not actually challenging the numbers. They're trying to find ways to dismiss the numbers as irrelevant or unimportant.
Okay, so science is always provisional. We can't guarantee the future, but it sure seems like these numbers are solid, peer reviewed, appears in Nature. Critics are challenging the interpretation, maybe small parts about the number, but largely realize that this 1% difference is not even close to the real genetic differences. Now, one response that I've heard is that our genome is full of what's called junk DNA. So the differences are like repetitive DNA and thus junk. Thus, we can ignore them and get a much smaller number, getting closer to that 1% if we assess the genome that way. Is that fair or reasonable?
Yeah, so that's exactly right, Sean. A lot of folks have tried to dismiss the differences as basically junk DNA. And they claim that this repetitive DNA that's newly discovered as different between humans and chimps is basically meaningless. It's not doing anything. So the differences don't mean anything. The only differences that matter, they would say, is that 1.6% of the single nucleotide variation, which again, is, as you correctly said, I think that probably is where they got that original 1% statistic. And so the question is this repetitive DNA that's different between humans and chimps junk? And the answer to that is definitely not. One of the most interesting things here, Sean, is that right around the same time that this Nature paper came out, there was another paper that came out in the journal Nucleic Acids Research.
Hmm.
And this paper was actually co authored by some of the same scientists who also authored the Nature paper reporting these completely sequenced ape genomes.
All
And
right.
this paper in the journal Nucleic Acids Research, it actually specifically looked at the repetitive DNA, the newly discovered repetitive DNA that is different between humans and chimps. And it found that it can have many, many important functions. And so this paper is actually making the case that the newly discovered repetitive DNA between humans and chimps, that it's not junk, and in fact is very important. To make a long story short, a lot of this repetitive DNA that's different between humans and chimps is what they call non-B DNA. And this non-B DNA is very important for forming different structural shapes in the DNA. And like you can have loops or hairpin turns or other shapes that this repetitive DNA helps to create in our chromosomes. And it's the shapes of these chromosomes, these structural shapes, that is created by this repetitive DNA that's very important for regulating many cellular processes. In fact, if I can just quote from this paper, it
Yeah.
talks about the fact that this non-B DNA is, quote, increasingly recognized as a major regulator of myriad processes in the mammalian cell. It says it's, quote, it's known to be, quote, important regulators of cellular processes and, quote, has unequivocal importance for genome function. And some of these functions include initiating DNA replication, being involved in regulating gene expression, a hugely important function, being involved in the functions of telomeres and also centromeres and other functions as well. So if folks want to dismiss this newly repetitive DNA that's repetitive between and different between humans and chimps, they're basically going against what the science says. The science says that this type of repetitive DNA can perform very, very important roles in the cell. Of course, it can perform sequence-based roles, but also structural roles that are involved in very important functions like regulating gene expression. So I won't get into all the scientific details of how that works,
Yeah.
but
That's
suffice
good.
to say, this study in nucleic acid research shows that the DNA that's different between humans and chimps, we cannot dismiss it as junk DNA.
So the term junk DNA it has roots in a certain worldview, really a naturalistic, materialistic worldview that would kind of assume that our DNA was cobbled together not by an intelligent designer, but a blind, purposeless process. Hence, either most or at least much of it has no purpose because it wasn't placed there intentionally. The problem is that's an assumption that ironically can stop scientific research. People say intelligent design is a science stopper. This is actually a science stopper because if people had assumed that the genome was intelligently designed, we would have looked for these features much earlier. But I just want to point out to people, again, the worldview implications and thoughts that are shaping so much of this. Now, here's another objection that I've heard, Casey. Maybe you can respond to this one
Sure.
for us.
Can I sound off on what you
Sure.
just said really quick?
Yeah.
So here's something interesting, just to go a little bit more detail on, quote, junk DNA. The Nobel Prize last year in physiology and medicine was actually awarded for the discovery of function of microRNAs, which were originally thought to be a type of
Wow.
junk DNA. So literally, they
Interesting.
awarded the Nobel Prize last year in physiology and medicine for discovering a type of function for junk DNA. And when I read through some of the writings talking about this Nobel Prize, there were some scientists who were saying that actually the reason why this evidence was originally not accepted in the scientific community is because people just dismissed it as junk DNA. So you're absolutely right. In fact, so much so that, last year's Nobel Prize, the acceptance of that discovery was hindered by this evolutionary view that our genomes are full of useless junk DNA. So you're absolutely right, Sean. This is a big issue. But what's interesting is that I would say in the last 10 or 15 years, we have seen nothing short of a scientific revolution on the question of junk DNA. There was an article in the journal Bioessays about 2 years ago that said we have seen what is called a Kuhnian paradigm shift in
Mm.
biology away from the idea of junk DNA. That basically just means a scientific shift, major shift in thinking in the scientific community. So junk DNA is no longer thought to be prevalent unless you're defending evolution, and then folks still bring it up a lot.
And just for those listening, when you say a Kuhnian revolution, this is Thomas Kuhn, who's a writer, that said science doesn't advance kind of like tinkering along, but has revolutions like an Einsteinian revolution, a Newtonian revolution that just radically shifts the paradigm. And for that to even be compared here is such a radical paradigm how we think about DNA, points out how significant this is. Let's shift to the second objection. And here's one that again, I'm sure you've heard this one as well. It's that humans already have a large percentage of intra-species genetic differences. So intra would be within the human genome. There's already a lot of differences, and some I've seen show up to like 10%. Thus, if we have 10% genetic differences within the human population, we shouldn't be surprised at a 15% difference with apes or chimps. And so, really, the data that we're discovering is not that significant.
Yeah, so we are learning a lot about the genome right now, Sean. We're developing better and better techniques for sequencing genomes, and we're able to study parts of the genome that we were not able to study until just recently. And so some folks are saying that based upon these new versions of human genomes that are being sequenced, we can say that we're up to 10% genetically different. So this is very interesting, and I find this to be a fascinating topic, but it really doesn't answer my argument. My argument is that people have been making this claim that we are 1% genetically different from chimps for years. And they've been using this as an argument for evolution. And that claim is wrong. It's wrong on both the facts and the logic. We can get into the logic more later, but
Yeah.
it's scientifically wrong. So, whether humans, the percent genetic difference between humans and humans, or say the percent genetic intra-species genetic differences in other species like chimpanzees or within orangutans or whatever, this is all very interesting, but it's simply not relevant to the
Mm,
point I'm making, which is to compare
mm,
the human and the chimpanzee genomes and ask how different are they. So let's just get that straight. This objection really involves changing the topic. It doesn't really answer
mm.
my argument, but this is still an area where there's a lot to learn. It seems like if you look at the alignable DNA within humans, that our differences are very, very low. From what I've seen, it's probably around 0.06% to 0.17% different
Oh,
within
my
the human
goodness.
species. Okay.
Okay.
That's a lot lower than between humans and chimps, where it's more like 1.6% different. I think that it's probably 9 to 16, times less different or 9 to 26 times less different within humans among our alignable DNA than it is between humans and chimps. And also, I've seen some evidence. Again, this is an area where there's still a lot being discovered, so there's a lot to learn. But I've seen some evidence that shows that the character of the differences in the non-alignable DNA between humans and chimps can be very different and of a lesser degree, or it's of a greater degree between humans and chimps than it is between humans and humans. Within humans, the differences in repetitive DNA usually amount to differences in copy numbers of the repeats. But between humans and chimps, we can see that the differences involve both differences in the number of copies of the repeats and differences in the sequences of those copies, in some cases at least. So again, still a lot we have to learn, but it seems like the character of the differences between humans and chimps, in some cases at least, can be of a greater nature than the character of the differences between one human to another. And by the way, it's not 10% difference typically between two humans. Some of the experts who I have seen talking about say that it's probably more typically maybe 4 to 5% genetically different
Okay.
when you compare two typical human beings. But again, this is still an active area of research. There's a lot
That's
that we
fair.
still have to learn.
I appreciate you qualify that, but it seems that we've seen the differences between humans and chimps minimized and the differences between humans and other humans maximized, which is probably driven by a worldview. And I realize I can do the same thing given my assumptions on a range of issues, but I think it's important to call out what's driving this. Now, some people might say this, all right, Casey, people have known this for 2 decades that there's 1% genetic difference. So why is this news?
Yeah, some folks are saying, this is old news. We've known this for a long time, that humans and chimps are more than 1% genetically different. And my response is, you're right. And that's great that you acknowledge that. I'm really appreciate that. And I actually respect the fact that some folks are acknowledging that we've known this for a long time. But then my response is, well, then why haven't you been calling out people from, folks who share your evolutionary view, who have been promoting the 1% genetic myth? Why are you only attacking me for pointing this out? You should have been also calling out folks from your own perspective who have been using this supposed 1% genetic difference between humans and chimps as an argument for evolution. And our critics, they devote their lives to debunking things that they think that we've long known are false. So, why attack me when I'm pointing out something that we also have known for a long time? I mean, I'm not going to worry about this objection too much. We're all allowed to talk about
Okay.
different topics. I think this is interesting, but I just find it interesting that people are saying, well, we've known this for a long time, Casey, this is old news. It's like, okay, well, if that's true, then where have you been? Why haven't you been calling out so many of the folks from your own sort of perspective that have been making this false argument for evolution?
Okay, that's fair. So far we've talked about how there's this claim that's persisted in University of Chicago books, Smithsonian, Bill Nye, a ton of other places about 1% genetic similarity humans and chimps. We see it's actually closer to 15%. So the evidence scientifically, so to speak, simply doesn't match up with it. Let's shift to what you mentioned earlier about what follows logically from this. So in some ways, just start with, I remember when Bill Dembski and I wrote Understand Intelligent Design, I think it came out in '08, so we wrote it 18 years ago or so. This new data was just kind of emerging. We were skeptical about it, but not with the confidence that we have today. So if I remember correctly, one of the points that we made is that even a 1% genetic difference, depending on where it is, could be very, very significant. So it wouldn't follow if we were 99% genetically similar, that 1% couldn't radically shift things. But I also think we argued that even if it's 99% similar, this could be a common ancestor, or it could be because of a common creator. Assumedly, you see it the same, but tell us what you think logically follows from this.
No, I absolutely see it in the same way as you do, Sean. Sometimes when I'm presenting on this topic, I will repeat that famous speech from Empire Strikes Back where Darth Vader confesses to Luke that he's his father. And I say, what if we were to take this, 40 or 50 word speech and just add a couple instances of the word not? It would completely change the meaning of the whole Star Wars saga. Like Luke, I am not your father. Join me. We
Great
cannot
example.
rule the galaxy together as father and son. We cannot destroy the emperor, blah, blah, blah. So it just a couple changes in specific locations can have radical changes in the meaning of a text or of a genetic code even. So I think that's very important to remember that, even a 1% different, if we turned out that we were only 1% genetically different from chimps, that could still have a great, what we call a phenotypic effect
Mm.
upon the organism, changing its actual body structure or the nature of its proteins, et cetera, et cetera. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, Sean, that we were in fact 99% genetically the same as a chimp. I don't think this really provides any kind of, strong evidence for common ancestry because, as I kind of alluded to earlier, common design can explain those functional similarities just as well as common descent. It's actually a very good design strategy to reuse functional components in different designs. We see that designers will reuse car or wheels on both cars and
Yeah.
airplanes, or reuse keyboards on both cell phones and laptops. If you're a computer programmer, I wrote about 30,000 lines of computer code during my PhD. I became very well versed in Python and kind of went deep down that rabbit hole. And, when I would create a new program, the very first thing I would do is I would hit copy and paste. I would copy an old program that was kind of similar to the new program I wanted to write, and I would use that old program as sort of a template for building the new program. So computer programmers will very regularly reuse code that works in new programs. So why would it be so surprising if we were intelligently designed to find that there is DNA code that's being reused between different organisms? I think it simply reflects that we have common design based upon a common blueprint to meet similar functional needs in different organisms. So if it turned out that we were 99% similar to chimps, that even when, we believed that was true, it never really struck me as an argument for common ancestry. I think common design can explain those similarities just as well as common descent.
Okay, that last phrase is exactly how I see it. That if we have some common ancestor and there's some mechanism that explains it, we might expect to see 99% genetic similarity. So it largely matches on to a Darwinian explanation. Largely.
Would we, Sean? Would we
But
though? I mean,
okay,
according
push
to
back.
evolutionists, according to some evolution, you can compare the genomes of different species. I could make these numbers up, but okay, now that we're only 85% genetically similar to a chimp, do you think that they're
Agreed.
abandoning common ancestry? Absolutely not. Some people have said that we're, 50% the same as a banana. I don't think that's true, but
Yeah.
every evolutionist on the planet thinks that we are related through common ancestry to a banana if you go back far enough. So I actually don't think this is an objective or rigorous argument at all. The more the genetic difference, what's going to happen is they're just going to push the timeline of when we supposedly diverged from a common ancestor back. And so it's basically an unfalsifiable argument. You're never going to find a percent genetic difference that, in my view, is going to allow them to actually refute common ancestry and evolution. And so I really don't see this as a serious argument for common ancestry, the way they typically structure their arguments.
Okay, so my point is, if it were 99% in common, that in principle it could be consistent with a Darwinian explanation. We'd
Oh, yeah.
expect to find similarity, but it's also similar. It also makes sense within the perspective of intelligent design for the reasons you mentioned. Smart designers reuse patterns that work. So in itself, it's somewhat neutral and doesn't prove design or prove evolution. It's neutral. Now that we found it's 85% and it's even greater difference, would you say now it's shifting towards challenging common descent in itself? Or, tell me what you think falls from this for common descent. Is this evidence against common descent now?
Yeah, to be honest with you, Sean, I have never seen the mere percent genetic similarity or difference statistic as an argument for or against common ancestry. And I've been saying this for years. This is not something new that I sort of just came up with. I was going through some old blog posts. I've been saying this since about 2008 was the earliest time that I could find myself writing about this. I I just don't think that the percent genetic similarity is relevant. That mere statistic is relevant or really, useful in answering the question of common ancestry. Now, I do think that there's other lines of evidence that are relevant. If you look at the fossil evidence,
Yep.
we can see a distinct break between the human-like body plan and our supposed ape-like, evolutionary precursors in the fossil record that I believe is a real problem for common ancestor and unguided Darwinian evolution. I think that the fossil evidence does not support common ancestry. If you look at many of the higher cognitive abilities of human beings, I think that there's a very serious break between humans and all other creatures that challenges evolutionary explanations. And I think it is also possible to make a genetics-based argument against unguided evolution, but it has to do with finding multiple mutations that are required to give you some functional advantage. And when you have a
Gotcha.
trait where you need multiple coordinated mutations before you get any functional advantage, according to the mathematics of how population genetics work, it can take very, very long periods of time to get those multiple mutations that are needed. I'll just say one thing here very quickly. There was a paper a number of years ago in the journal Genetics in 2008, which said that if you had a trait in human beings that just required two specific mutations to be present before you gain some functional advantage to help you to survive and reproduce, a trait, just two mutations needed to help you survive and reproduce, it would take over 200 million years for a trait like that to arise in a typical population of hominids. Okay.
Mm,
That is way longer than what is allowed by the fossil record. So that is the kind of, we call that a waiting times argument. That is the kind of argument that I think could be made from genetics to challenge an unguided evolutionary origin of humans or even common ancestry. But I just don't think that the percent genetic similarity statistic is going to be helpful in
is
addressing these
relevant to
questions.
it.
Yeah,
Okay, so
yeah.
one
But
of my
very appreciate that question, Sean. It's a really important question.
one of my colleagues at Biola who works with Discovery, Doug Axe, has done some of the best work on this. His book, Undeniable, same title, I think, as Bill Nye's book. Let's shelve that conversation. We can come back to it. There's also other things like people point toward like pseudogenes and other things within the genetic code that people will say are evidence for common descent. We just don't need to address that right now. I pointed out to say we're not pretending to address everything here. We're dealing with one icon. But people listening, let me just make one important distinction. We've used evolution and common descent somewhat synonymously on this program, but they're not the same things. The word evolution is equivocal. It could mean small changes within a kind. It can mean changes across kind. Now we're getting towards common descent. But then you also have to have the mechanism that drives it. So there's some intelligent design proponents, I believe Behe is one of them, that is okay with common descent, but challenges the mechanism behind it, the idea that there could be a naturalistic mechanism to explain it, and still says, even if there is common descent, there's signs of intelligence. So I just want to put that out there for folks to make sure they're tracking with this. Uh,
That's such a crucial point you just made, Sean, that there are sort of 3 main ways we can understand the idea of evolution. Mere change over time, which nobody disagrees with, change within a
yep.
species, nobody disagrees with that. The idea that, species share common ancestors, it could be universal common ancestry. And as you correctly said, within the ID camp, some folks accept common ancestry, some are skeptics. I tend to be a skeptic, but my good friend Michael Behe, he supports common ancestry. We all agree there's evidence for design in the natural
Mm.
world. And so that's where we disagree with the third definition of evolution, which is that random mutation and unguided natural selection and other sort of standard unguided evolutionary mechanisms that they built all the complexity of life. And that's where we take greatest issue with the standard evolutionary model. So very well said, you the way you just parsed that out, Sean.
You've written a piece in the New York Post that came out recently talking about this. And the title was something effective like kind of this Smithsonian monkeying with the evidence. I thought was creative, whether that was you or the folks there at the New York Post. But you reached out to the Smithsonian, sent them a letter, and I haven't seen the letter, but I assume you made your case and did it kindly because I know you. Did they respond at all? And if so, what did they say?
Yeah, I did not actually give the title for the New York Post article, as is
Okay.
often the case. The editors did that, but I thought it was a
Mm.
clever title, and
It
it
was.
certainly worked. But yes, I did write a letter to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington D.C., um, basically notifying them about this letter and saying, or sorry, about this paper that just came out in Nature, and saying, look, this paper shows that we are much more than just 1.2 percent genetically different from chimps, as your exhibit states. And I quoted the statistics and the findings from this paper in the letter that I sent the Smithsonian, and I encouraged them to update their exhibit. They did respond with a very short, kind of a non-response, I would call it. They said, yes, thank you. We will take this into account next time we update our exhibits. Does that mean they will change it? When will they update the exhibits? They didn't say, but at least, they received the letter and they acknowledged, that I had sent it, and I appreciated
Mm.
that. And so I don't know if or when it will happen or make any difference. I suppose only time will tell, but we can always hope for the best.
Are there other areas of scientific misinformation at the Smithsonian that either you saw when you were there in person or you've just seen in your research?
Yeah, definitely, Sean. In fact, when you look at the fossil evidence, they actually have some spectacular exhibits showing some of the fossils, hominid fossils that are thought to be relevant to human origins. But unfortunately, in my opinion, in many cases, the Smithsonian's Human Origins exhibit, it either overstates or misstates the evidence for human evolution.
Mm.
I'll give you just a couple examples here. In one case, they talk about this ancient species called Sahelanthropus chidensis. They call it an early human that, quote, walked on 2 legs. But there are leading paleoanthropologists who would sharply dispute this claim. In fact, there was an article in Nature, this was long ago in 2002, that found that Sahelanthropus was an ape and that many features link the specimen to chimpanzees, gorillas, or both to the exclusion of hominids. In other words, this Nature paper said that Sahelanthropus is not a human ancestor. Certainly, it would be wrong to call it a, quote, early human, as the Smithsonian's Human Origins exhibit calls it. And then there was an article in the Journal of Human Evolution a few years ago in 2020 that looked at the femur of Sahelanthropus and found that it would look like that of you would find in a chimp-like quadruped. So in other words, it probably didn't walk upright and it wasn't a human ancestor. Um, if you go on in the Human Origins exhibit, it actually says, quote, we became human gradually, unquote, and that we evolved from, quote, earlier primates. Again, I think the distinction is to try to blur trying to blur the distinction between humans and other creatures. But the great Harvard evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr, he said that there is a, quote, large unbridged gap in the fossil record between the Australopithecines and the first human-like members of our genus Homo. In fact, he said in his own words that we're, quote, in a position of not having any fossils that can serve as missing links. And one scientific commentator called this scientific evidence, quote, a Big Bang theory of human evolution. Actually, he said that we are, quote, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links. So my question is, why doesn't the Smithsonian Institution basically disclose this information, that there are serious gaps in the hominid fossil record that do not show this nice gradual evolutionary pathway that is predicted by Darwin's theory, in which they claim exists. Instead, we see serious gaps, large unbridged gaps, according to Ernst Mayr, in the hominid fossil record that I think pose a serious challenge to standard evolutionary models of human origin.
Mhm.
So, unfortunately, the Smithsonian Institution, it's sort of got its own perspective. You might even say an agenda to promote that perspective. And they really don't acknowledge leading scientists or credible scientific literature that challenges the view that they're promoting.
So in one case, with a 98.5 or so genetic similarity, it's false. And we pretty much know that, at least with confidence right now. The other one, it's like, they're stating something for which there's a controversy, but they're just giving one side, should be more balanced here. And there's an agenda or a worldview behind it. By the way, taking public funds. And so minimally, they should at least show the controversy when this isn't just you at Discovery, me at Biola saying I'm taking issues with this, but other leading scientists and publications like Nature calling them out on it. I'd like to see them catch up with the data. So if you hear stuff, Casey, if you see a change that's made, this might more be on your radar than mine, let me know. I'd love to update folks or even people watching this. If you see an update or you're at the Smithsonian or you have another example of what you think is misstated evidence for evolution, link it below. I would like to see it. Where does this go next as far as you can see things, Casey?
Yeah, so I think that right now it's just going to be interesting to see how the data plays out. There's so many new discoveries we're making about the human genome, about genomes in general, about functions for junk DNA. Sean, you mentioned pseudogenes earlier. I know we're not going to dive into that today, but that would be a fun conversation for another time, because there's many scientific papers that are finding function even for pseudogenes now. So there's so much more that we're learning about the genome. As an intelligent design proponent, I personally am very encouraged by the data, because we were
Mm.
predicting function for junk DNA for multiple decades. And now the scientific research has confirmed that the intelligent design prediction is correct. And this is helping us to actually make sense of these newly discovered differences between the human genome and the chimp genome. So it's all coming together, in my view, in a sort of paradigm or perspective that is very consistent with intelligent design. And I'm just going to keep following the evidence, and we'll continue to report on it on evolutionnews.org, our main website, and just see where it goes.
When Dembski and I were writing Understand Intelligent Design again, 2007 came out 2008. One of the things that I remember was really popping up on the radar was that intelligent design is not a science because it doesn't make any predictions. Not only did we say that's false, it makes predictions, and a lot of ID proponents over the years have said specifically, I think Myers has, is he said, Stephen Myers said, we will find more purposes for what's called junk DNA, and that's not only found to be true, but someone gets a Nobel award-winning recognition for discovering this past year. So I have a lot of confidence, like you do, moving forward, that we'll find more and more purposes within the genome that were considered junk. Did I miss anything? Maybe just sum up for us what your key takeaway is, so you're not misunderstood by people who are watching this. And did I miss anything in the interview? You're like, you know what? I really wanted to make that point.
Sure. No, I appreciate that, Sean, and appreciate the opportunity just to talk about this. But yeah, so I mean, my main point here is that we've all heard for years that the human and chimp genomes are 99 or so percent similar, and 1 or 2% genetically different. If you're living, breathing, and paying attention, you probably heard this argument. And people have used that statistic as an argument for evolution, for human chimp common ancestry. My main point is that this icon of evolution is wrong. And it's wrong actually by over an order of magnitude. The data, the best data that's coming out now, shows that we are more like about 14.9 or even 15% genetically different from a chimpanzee. No, I'm not saying that number, the correct, more accurate data point that we have now, I'm not saying that necessarily refutes evolution or refutes common ancestry. What I'm saying is that this common icon of evolution, this argument you have heard being made for evolution, that argument is wrong. and we need to put it to bed and move on. And then we can have a more robust conversation about what the
Mm.
data really says and whether or not, we are in fact genetically related to chimps and we did evolve through standard evolutionary mechanisms. I hope some of the critics will just acknowledge, hey, okay, this is Casey's right, maybe. I don't know if they would say that, but or not Casey's right, but just this icon of evolution was wrong. Okay. I don't need to be acknowledged to be right, but just that the icon of evolution is wrong, that a lot of evolution proponents got it wrong when they made this claim that we were 1% genetically different from chimps and that this is somehow evidence for human evolution. Acknowledge that they got it wrong and let's move on and continue to have this conversation in a civil and informed way. That's what my heart desires. If there are other folks out there who want the same thing, I'd love to hear from them and maybe we can have that conversation. It'd be a lot of fun.
All right, Casey, last question. If a follow-up comes in a journal article as prestigious as Nature, and they go, you know what, we got it wrong. It's 0.5% genetic difference, and we blew it, whether 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. Will you come back and say, you know what, I'll own it. Data is different. It's now been assessed. You would come back on and say, you know what, we got to follow truth and own it. Do I have your word? I can hold you to this. This will be on YouTube. Would you come back
No,
and
no,
correct that?
no problem, Sean.
Okay,
Absolutely. I mean, I
good.
will follow the data where it leads. In fact, I've made a couple of minor mistakes in the way that I have described the paper in Nature, and I've got a couple of posts coming out on Evolution News that'll to talk about. I need to correct one little thing. It doesn't affect
Great.
my overall commentary or the points I'm making, but we make corrections when we make mistakes. It's no big deal. Everybody gets things wrong sometimes, and this is how science goes. You learn new things. You improve your arguments. You accept when the data changes your understanding of the situation. So no problem there at all, Sean.
I knew you were going to say that, and I knew you would come back because I've known you for years. But I also point out that if you're willing to own some things that you've missed, and that's all of us have missed some things, you're going to cite that in articles, then people watching this who have advanced this argument, we invite them to do the same. And I hope that they will for the sake of science. One of its strengths is that it's self-correcting and follows the evidence wherever it leads. Casey, this has been fun. I can't believe we waited so long to do this. 10 years ago, you wrote a chapter for me in a book, A New Kind of Apologist, and we probably knew each other 10 years before that. But keep me posted on stories that drop like this. My audience will want to know when there's kind of fascinating big data and kind of dramatic, interesting stories that unfold that have worldview apologetic implications. Keep us posted on that because we're going to revisit this topic time and time again. Folks, check out Casey Luskin. His work online, his blogs, has some excellent blogs where he fills in even some of the details we didn't get to today, a series of blogs. And also his book, Science and Human Origins. And while you're at it, make sure you hit subscribe. We've got some other interviews coming up again on near-death experiences. We're going to revisit the resurrection. We've got a range of topics coming up, including the amazing conversion of a former Muslim who argues that many Muslims are coming to faith. Make sure you hit subscribe. And if you've thought about studying apologetics or science and religion, we have 2 master's degrees out of Biola. One is in apologetics. I teach in that, and also a degree in science and religion, in which you take a couple of my classes as well. Information is below. Check it out. Think about joining me. Casey, this was fun. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Felt like a late night conversation back in college when we're trying to figure things out. Although hopefully we've come a little ways since our freshman year in high school or in college. No insult to freshmen. Like you said, we're glad if any of them watch, but this is fun. We'll do it again for sure.
Thanks a lot, Sean. And by the way, quick point, that book, Science and Human Origins, was actually co-authored also by our friend Doug Axe and also Ann Gager. So I appreciate you recommending that and look forward to doing it again sometime. Thanks a lot, Sean.
Thanks, brother.